The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room fell into a silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls, the kind of silence that made even the cameras hum louder in the corners. Senator Lindsey Graham slammed his gavel down with a force that echoed through the marble corridors of the Capitol. The sound was meant to intimidate, to remind everyone who held authority in this room, to put a younger opponent in her place before she could even open her mouth. His face flushed crimson as he leaned forward, eyes narrowing, and his southern drawl sharpened with irritation. He jabbed his finger toward the woman seated at the witness table. "Young lady, you need to learn some respect." His voice cut through the chamber like a whip. "You think you can waltz in here and lecture us about justice when you barely understand how this institution works?" The words hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Around the room, aides froze, reporters paused mid-keystroke, and the spectators in the gallery shifted in their seats, sensing that something electric was about to unfold. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat with her arms crossed, her chin tilted upward, and her eyes locked on Graham with the steady fire of someone who had seen this act before. She was 42, a freshman congresswoman from Texas, but she carried herself with the poise of a seasoned litigator who had spent years staring down hostile judges and smug opposing counsel. What Graham didn't know, or rather, what he had underestimated, was that Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for this exact moment for weeks. Inside her leather briefcase, resting beside her chair, was a meticulously organized folder of documents. Court transcripts, op-eds, floor speeches, campaign finance reports, and carefully highlighted quotations, all evidence waiting like a loaded weapon for the moment Graham pushed too far. She had anticipated his arrogance, his need to dominate, his habit of belittling opponents with less seniority. And she had planned her counterattack with surgical precision. The cameras zoomed in, catching the flicker of a smile at the corner of Crockett's lips as she slowly uncrossed her arms. To Graham, that smile might have looked like defiance. In reality, it was the calm satisfaction of someone who knew the trap was already set. He thought he was about to humiliate her, to remind the country why he had survived over 2 decades in Washington. But he was walking straight into the kind of devastating takedown that would ripple far beyond this hearing. Senator Lindsey Graham had built his career on moments like these. At 68, the South Carolina Republican was a fixture in Washington. He had served in both the House and the Senate, weathered scandal after scandal, shifted alliances when it suited him, and mastered the art of political theater. He thrived on confrontation, on raising his voice until it filled the chamber, on gesturing wildly until the cameras had no choice but to linger on him. He knew how to grandstand, how to make witnesses squirm, how to turn a hearing into a performance that would play well back home with his base. His staffers had briefed him thoroughly for this session. The topic was criminal justice reform, and Graham walked into the room convinced he held the high ground. He had been told the witnesses would be easy to dismiss, especially the freshman representative from Texas, young, progressive, eager to make a splash, but ultimately inexperienced. His aides had assured him this would be a chance to score points, to put another ambitious Democrat in her place, to remind everyone why Lindsey Graham remained one of the Senate's sharpest interrogators. But Jasmine Crockett was not the type of opponent Graham had faced before. Her background was more formidable than his staff had realized. Before entering Congress, she had been a civil rights attorney who specialized in holding powerful institutions accountable. She had fought police departments over misconduct, challenged private prison companies in federal court, defended both officers and victims, and developed a reputation for her unshakable composure under pressure. In courtroom after courtroom, she had dismantled opponents with facts and logic until juries had no choice but to side with her. She was not intimidated by raised voices or angry glares. She had seen them too many times. The stakes were high for both. For Graham, this hearing was a platform. He was facing a tough re-election fight back home, and he needed to project strength and authority. Any sign of weakness, any moment where he appeared rattled or bested by a Democrat, could be weaponized against him. For Crockett, this was her chance to prove she belonged in Washington's most ruthless arenas. She knew the risks of being dismissed as an inexperienced freshman, and she came determined to show that preparation could triumph over seniority. The room was packed that morning. Representatives from law enforcement organizations, civil rights advocates, legal scholars, and journalists from every major network filled the gallery. They could feel the tension building even before Graham opened his mouth. His opening statement was combative, peppered with criticism of so-called radical reformers, his tone dripping with disdain for younger lawmakers who thought they could change things. He leaned heavily on his relationships with law enforcement, positioning himself as the seasoned defender of order. Crockett listened without interruption, jotting down notes, her face unreadable. While other witnesses shifted uncomfortably under Graham's glare, she remained still, calm, waiting. She had heard his kind of rhetoric before, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he overplayed his hand. When Graham finally called on her, his condescension was immediate. "Before you begin, Representative," he said, leaning forward with that rehearsed smile, "let me remind you and everyone watching that we're here to have a serious discussion, not to listen to campaign speeches." Crockett looked directly at him and replied evenly, "Senator Graham, I appreciate your concern about campaign speeches. I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss on that very topic." Her subtle jab earned a ripple of suppressed chuckles from the gallery. Graham's eyes narrowed. He motioned for her to continue, but he was already irritated as Crockett laid out her testimony, statistics about incarceration rates, stories of communities impacted by systemic inequality. Graham interrupted repeatedly. "How many years have you served in law enforcement?" he demanded. "How many crime scenes have you been to? How many police officers have you worked alongside?" Her answers were calm, factual. She explained her years working with both victims and police officers, her collaborations with departments on reform. Graham cut her off, waving his hand dismissively. "Being a lawyer is different from being a legislator, young lady. This isn't a courtroom where you can just argue your way to victory." The phrase "young lady" landed like a slap. Several members of the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Democratic senators exchanged looks of irritation but remained silent, unwilling to intervene. Graham was in full performance mode, his voice growing louder, his gestures more dramatic, his finger jabbing across the table. "You know what your problem is," he said, his voice booming. "You come in here with your fancy ideas about reform, but you don't understand the real world. You don't understand what police officers face every day. You don't understand what victims go through." Crockett remained perfectly composed. "Senator, I've represented both victims of crime and police officers. I've worked with law enforcement and with grieving families. I think I understand more than you give me credit for." "No, you don't," Graham snapped, his face reddening. "You understand theory. You understand talking points. But you don't understand reality." He leaned back in his chair, turning toward the cameras, his voice rising. "This is exactly the problem with Washington today. We've got people who think a few years of experience gives them the right to lecture those of us who've been fighting these battles for decades." His voice was nearly a shout now, his tone dripping with superiority. "You need to learn your place in this institution. Some of us have been here for decades because we know how things really work. Respect, experience, that's what matters." The chamber froze. Even some of Graham's Republican colleagues shifted uneasily. The moment had gone from aggressive questioning to something uglier, something that carried the stench of arrogance. Jasmine Crockett slowly looked up from her notes, locked eyes with Graham, and let the silence stretch. Then she smiled, not a broad grin, but the kind of quiet smile that signaled she had been waiting for this exact line. "Senator Graham," she said softly, her voice steady and measured, "you mentioned respect and experience. I think that's an excellent place for us to begin." She reached down, unlatched her briefcase, and pulled out a thick folder. The sound of the clasps clicking open echoed in the tense silence. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras zoomed tighter. Graham shifted in his chair, unaware of the avalanche about to hit him. "Senator, you've just lectured me on qualifications and respect," Crockett continued. "So I think it's only fair we examine your record on these matters." "I've been serving this country for over 20 years, Graham said, his tone defensive but still confident. "My record speaks for itself." "You're absolutely right," Crockett replied, pulling out the first document. "Your record does speak for itself. And that's exactly what we're going to let it do." She held up a printed transcript. "Here's your floor speech from 2018 during the criminal justice reform debate. You said, and I quote, 'We cannot continue to ignore the clear evidence that our criminal justice system treats people differently based on race and economic status. The time for incremental change has passed. We need bold action. The room erupted in murmurs. Senators glanced at each other, startled. Graham's confident expression faltered. That statement, Crockett said smoothly, sounds remarkably similar to the very proposals you're calling dangerous and unrealistic today. In fact, several of my recommendations are word-for-word identical to those you championed just 5 years ago. She pulled another paper from the folder. Here's your 2019 op-ed in the Charleston Post, where you demanded comprehensive police reform and criticized colleagues more interested in political theater than real solutions. Should I read that one, too? Circumstances change, political reality changes, Graham stammered. What seemed reasonable then? Oh, I completely understand circumstances change, Crockett interrupted gently. What's fascinating is when they changed for you. She slid a large timeline chart across the table. Here we see your public positions over the last 8 years. Notice how your views shifted dramatically in early 2021. January, to be precise, the same month you announced your re-election campaign. The same month your campaign finance reports show a surge in donations from private prison companies and law enforcement unions opposed to reform. Gasps filled the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously. Photographers' shutters clicked like machine guns. Graham sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his complexion pale. And since you've questioned my experience, let's compare, Crockett continued, her tone now sharp as a scalpel. I've defended 14 police officers in misconduct cases. I've worked with 6 departments on training reform. I've prosecuted 3 private prison companies for federal violations. I've represented over 200 crime victims. And here, she placed a letter on the table, is a recommendation from Chief Michael Rodriguez of the Dallas Police Department praising my practical understanding of law enforcement challenges. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang. Meanwhile, according to your official biography, you've never prosecuted a case, never defended a police officer, never represented a crime victim, never worked in law enforcement. Your legal experience is limited to private practice in business law. The blow landed like a knockout punch. The room went silent. Graham's reputation as a master interrogator evaporated in front of live cameras. So when you question my qualifications, Senator, Crockett concluded, her voice calm, steady, devastating, I have to wonder, what exactly are yours, other than shifting your positions whenever campaign contributions demand it? The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Graham's allies could not meet his eyes. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Reporters would later say it felt like watching a trial lawyer dismantle a witness on the stand, except the witness was one of the Senate's most seasoned members, and Jasmine Crockett had just shown the nation what preparation, precision, and courage could accomplish in the face of arrogance. For a moment after Jasmine Crockett's final words, the Senate chamber felt like a church where someone had just dropped a thunderclap. Reporters who had been half-bored minutes earlier were suddenly electric with motion, pens scratching, fingers clattering against laptop keys. Even the marble columns seemed to absorb the weight of what had just happened. Senator Lindsey Graham shifted in his chair, tugging at his collar as if the air had grown too thick. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. For a man known for his quick tongue and endless arsenal of retorts, the silence was deafening. A single bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Crockett didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply leaned back in her chair, hands folded neatly on the table, as if she'd just completed a cross-examination she had rehearsed 1,000 times. The restraint was almost more devastating than a victory lap. She looked composed, professional, untouchable. Chairman Dubin cleared his throat, glanced at Graham, and muttered something about moving on to the next witness. But everyone knew the hearing was effectively over. The other senators' questions felt perfunctory, their voices subdued, as though none wanted to follow the act they had just witnessed. Outside, in the hallways of the Capitol, staffers whispered into phones with the urgency of people reporting a national emergency. You won't believe what just happened in judiciary. She destroyed him. It was like a trial on live TV, and Graham was the defendant. By the time the hearing adjourned, the clip was already racing across Twitter. A young reporter for Politico had posted a 2-minute video with the caption, Jasmine Crockett just dismantled Lindsey Graham in front of the entire Senate Judiciary Committee. Within an hour, the post had been retweeted 50,000 times. By evening, It had surpassed 1 million. Cable news ran the exchange on loop. CNN's afternoon anchor leaned forward with wide eyes as she replayed Crockett's line about campaign donations. MSNBC's primetime hosts hailed it as a turning point in political discourse, calling Crockett the new voice of accountability. Even Fox News, scrambling for spin, played the clip repeatedly, though their commentators attempted to paint her as disrespectful and opportunistic. Yet the footage itself told a different story, her calm against his bluster, her facts against his sputtering defenses. Late-night comedians pounced. On The Daily Show, the host replayed Graham's young lady comment before cutting to a skit of a toddler in a suit slamming a toy gavel. Audience laughter roared. Memes flooded Instagram and TikTok. Crockett calmly opening her folder became a looping GIF labeled "When you bring receipts to the argument." By the next morning, Jasmine Crockett's name was the top trending topic on every platform. Her follow count on Twitter tripled overnight. Small donor contributions poured into her campaign at such a pace that her website briefly crashed. Grassroots groups circulated petitions urging her to run for higher office, some even whispering Senate 2028 with stars in their eyes. Inside Lindsey Graham's office, however, the mood was apocalyptic. His senior staff gathered in the wood-paneled conference room, the television muted but still flashing headlines about his humiliation. One aide muttered that donors were already calling, nervous about being linked to a sinking ship. Another reported that Graham's pollster had warned of an immediate drop in approval ratings back in South Carolina. Graham sat at the head of the table, jaw clenched, fingers drumming against the polished wood. He looked older than his 68 years, the bravado drained from his eyes. "This will blow over," he said finally, though his tone carried more hope than conviction. "We've been through storms before. We'll call it political theater, say she ambushed me. My base won't abandon me over some freshman Democrat grandstanding." But even as he said it, he could hear the hollowness. He had watched the footage himself the night before, and what struck him wasn't Crockett's words, it was how calm she had been, how prepared. The contrast was brutal. He, the seasoned senator, shouting like a cornered man. She, the newcomer, methodically dismantling his credibility. No amount of spin could erase that visual. Meanwhile, Crockett's team barely had time to breathe. Reporters flooded her office with requests for interviews. Producers begged her to appear on Sunday shows. Civil rights groups issued statements applauding her courage. Senior Democrats who had barely glanced at her in the past were suddenly calling, congratulating, offering alliances. Yet Crockett herself remained focused, even wary. In private, she told her aides, "One viral moment doesn't change the work we came here to do. If I let this go to my head, I'll be no better than the people we're fighting against." Still, she couldn't deny the momentum. When she walked through the Capitol the next day, staffers she had never met nodded respectfully, as though acknowledging a shift in the hierarchy. Back in South Carolina, the reaction was seismic. Local newspapers ran headlines like "Graham embarrassed on national stage." Conservative talk radio hosts tried to rally behind him, but callers flooded the lines with frustration. "I've supported Lindsey for years," one lifelong Republican admitted on air, "but that woman made him look like a fool. His lost touch." Donors whispered about withholding checks. Grassroots challengers smelled blood. By the end of the week, one ambitious state representative announced a primary challenge, citing Graham's embarrassing performance as proof it was time for new leadership. The story grew legs internationally. British tabloids compared the showdown to Prime Minister's questions, with headlines like "American lawmaker schools senator in brutal takedown." Commentators in France and Germany framed it as evidence of generational change in U.S. politics. In Nigeria, a newspaper ran the clip under the headline "Young Black Woman Teaches Old White Senator Respect." Inside Washington, colleagues studied the footage like a game tape. Some Republicans muttered darkly that Graham had become a liability. Democrats, usually fractured by internal squabbles, rallied briefly around Crockett as a symbol of what their new generation could achieve. A few senior members even pulled her aside, whispering that she had done what many had dreamed of doing for years, puncturing Graham's aura of invincibility. The personal toll on Graham was visible. In hearings over the following weeks, he seemed diminished, hesitant. His once booming voice now cracked when challenged. Where he used to command the cameras, reporters now lingered on him only to catch the latest sign of his decline. Staffers leaked stories of his temper flaring behind closed doors, of late-night phone calls begging allies to defend him on television. Crockett, in contrast, grew into the role thrust upon her. She handled interviews with measured grace, never crowing about her victory, always redirecting the conversation back to policy. "This was never about me versus Senator Graham," she told one interviewer. "This was about accountability. If we can't hold each other accountable here in Washington, how can we ask the American people to trust us?" The line was clipped and replayed endlessly, reinforcing her image as principled rather than opportunistic. Her popularity soared not only among progressives but among moderates weary of political theater. Polls showed her favorability climbing across demographic lines. At town halls in her Texas district, constituents greeted her with standing ovations. Children came clutching homemade posters with her name, while elderly voters told her she reminded them of the fighters we used to have in Congress. Still, Crockett remained cautious. In private conversations with her closest aides, she admitted, "The higher they lift you up, the faster they'll try to tear you down. We need to stay grounded." Her team worked tirelessly to channel the momentum into concrete legislation, pushing forward reform bills with newfound backing from colleagues who suddenly wanted their names attached to her proposals. One evening, weeks after the hearing, Crockett returned to her apartment in D.C., exhausted after another whirlwind day of votes and interviews. She dropped her briefcase by the door and sank onto the couch. For the first time since the confrontation, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She replayed the scene in her mind, the gavel slam, the young lady, the silence before she unveiled her folder. She hadn't just defended herself that day, she had shifted the balance of power, if only slightly, in a city that rarely changed. Across town, Lindsey Graham sat alone in his Senate office, the lights dim, the halls quiet. He scrolled through headlines on his phone, each one a reminder of his fall. His phone buzzed with another donor pulling out, another ally declining to appear on his behalf. He set it down, leaned back, and closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, he wondered if his career was truly over, and in living rooms across America, millions of people who had long grown cynical about Washington felt a flicker of something rare, the sense that truth, preparation, and courage could still cut through the noise. Jasmine Crockett had not only dismantled a senator, she had reminded the nation that power, when wielded with integrity, could still make history. Months later, the echoes of that Senate hearing still reverberated across Washington. What had seemed, in the moment, like just another tense exchange in an endless cycle of political theater had instead hardened into something larger, a cultural marker. Staffers, journalists, and even late-night hosts had started referring to it simply as the Crockett moment. Everyone knew what it meant for Jasmine Crockett. The weeks after the hearing had been a blur. Invitations poured in from universities asking her to deliver keynote addresses on integrity in public service. Civil rights organizations honored her at black tie galas, presenting plaques engraved with phrases like "fearless voice of accountability." Book agents called her office with offers that made her aides' eyes widen. She turned most of them down, insisting she wanted to focus on legislation. But her refusal only deepened the perception that she was authentic. Her inbox overflowed with messages from young women, especially Black and Latina law students, who told her they had watched her calmly dismantle Graham on live TV and decided to pursue politics after all. One wrote, "I always thought people like me had no place in that world. Watching you, I realized we do." Crockett read those letters late at night, long after her staff had gone home, sometimes with tears in her eyes. In committee meetings, colleagues who had once brushed past her now sought her input. Senior Democrats invited her to closed-door strategy sessions. Even a few Republicans, quietly impressed by her preparation, stopped her in the hallways to admit, always off the record, that she had handled herself with unusual skill. She carried herself with humility, but she was also aware of the subtle shift. Power in Washington often moved like an undercurrent, invisible until it surfaced. And she could feel it now, pulling her into a new orbit. Lindsey Graham, meanwhile, drifted in the opposite direction. His re-election campaign, once considered routine, descended into chaos. Donors peeled away, worried about throwing money at a sinking ship. Conservative media figures who had once defended him hesitated, unwilling to tether themselves to a man whose most viral clip now showed him sputtering under pressure. Town halls in South Carolina grew hostile. Constituents held up printouts of his 2018 reform speeches, reading his own words back to him. One veteran in Charleston shouted, "Why should we believe anything you say anymore when you change positions like the wind?" Graham snapped back defensively, which only fueled the headlines. B.Y. Summer, a young, fiery state representative, announced a primary challenge, her campaign video opening with a stark line, "We need leaders who fight for us, not ones who get humiliated in Washington." The ad showed Crockett's dismantling of Graham in slow motion, set to ominous music. The contrast was devastating. Inside the Senate, Graham's colleagues grew restless. He still had allies, but fewer than before. In private meetings, they complained that he had become a distraction, his every public appearance overshadowed by the memory of that one disastrous morning. His once prized committee assignments were no longer guaranteed. Power, so carefully built over decades, was slipping through his fingers like sand. Meanwhile, the Crockett moment became a touchstone in American culture. College political science classes dissected the exchange frame by frame, analyzing how tone, posture, and preparation shaped public perception. Media outlets ran anniversary pieces, asking what it meant for generational change in politics. Think tanks invited Crockett to panels with titles like "The Future of Accountability in American Government." Even Hollywood took notice. A popular streaming service announced a documentary titled Receipts, The Day Congress Changed, featuring interviews with reporters, staffers, and Crockett herself. Trailers replayed her calm line, "So when you question my qualifications, Senator, I have to wonder, what exactly are yours?" Like a battle cry, Crockett watched all of this with a mix of gratitude and wariness. She knew fame in politics was a double-edged sword. Today's hero could be tomorrow's target. Still, she also recognized the opportunity. If she handled it wisely, this moment could be more than a viral clip. It could be the foundation of a movement. Her team began sketching out a long-term vision. A statewide run in Texas wasn't off the table. Some whispered about the Senate. Others, emboldened by the electricity she generated, whispered even further. Crockett herself dismissed such talk publicly, but in quiet moments she admitted to herself she could feel history nudging her forward. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, Crockett stood on the balcony outside her office, looking out at the city bathed in orange light. The air carried the faint chill of change. Below her, tourists snapped photos, unaware of the decisions being weighed in the buildings around them. She thought of the young girl who had written to her, saying she'd decided to pursue law because of that hearing. She thought of her grandmother, who had once told her, "Baby, don't let them make you small." And she thought of Lindsey Graham, somewhere across town, perhaps staring at the same sunset, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Washington was full of fleeting moments, but some crystallized into legend. The Crockett moment had done more than humble a senator.